Hello and welcome back. So we're approaching American Thanksgiving, the point in the season when your team should be in a playoff spot, and some of the players that you've drafted in your fantasy leagues haven't gotten it turned around yet, and maybe you're panicked a little bit. Today we're going to go over the 5 most egregiously disappointing players thus far this season, and I'll give you the data and some advice on what to do with each of them. But before we dive in, it is important not to panic. Don't make rash decisions when it comes to players that you've drafted in the first 6 rounds or so. I was saying all throughout the preseason that a mistake in one of these rounds could kill your season. And if you've made one of these mistakes, or if you've picked one of the players we're going to talk about today, you need to make sure that you're getting the most out of that player's value and not making dumb decisions right now. Otherwise, your season will be over. So the question is, which of these guys should you be patient with? Which should you try to get out from under? And more specifically, how do you do that? And lastly, are there any buy low targets out of this bunch? Let's get into it. So we're going to go in reverse order in terms of ADP during the drafting period, and Teuvu Teravainen was drafted ADP 83.8, usually in the 6th to 8th round range depending on league size. And that means he's not completely destroying your team because you did have a few picks before him, but if you were banking on another solid year from him, you aren't getting what you wanted. Now, historically, he's been between 0.7 and 0.92 points per game, very assist heavy, but lately in Carolina, he's a power play machine. This year, it's very different. He's definitely been assist heavy, but no goals at all, 7 assists, and only 1 power play point on the season. So that is a little bit troubling. And he's currently on IR with an upper body injury, and according to Rod Brindamore, he isn't exactly close to coming back anytime soon. So that leaves the question, what do you do with Teravainen? Now, assist-heavy power play producers are a lot more common on the waiver wire than some other names we'll see on this list. So I would recommend checking the weekly data draft power play producers section of the weekly updates video for whoever has it going on right now in the power play department. There are always guys getting hot, especially on power plays that you wouldn't necessarily assume are great, like Seattle's power play, San Jose's power play, Arizona's power play. We cover all that in the weekly video. An example this week would be a guy like Adam Henrique. We mentioned him in the video very briefly. Previously, it might have been a guy like Burakovsky or Dominik Kubalik earlier in the season. These guys can act as a stopgap measure until you get your player back off of IR. But either way, you're not necessarily going to want to wait for Teravainen the entire season. If you have him, I would suggest looking to try to target Max Pacioretty. Now, he's a little bit owned up, so he might be there on your wire, but if not, you might have to float a lowball trade offer for Pacioretty. But he's skated for the first time since his Achilles injury this week, and that's not necessarily meaning that he's coming back anytime soon, but Pacioretty makes his money with his release and his goal-scoring ability, and that will likely help Carolina's offense, and it'll help their power play. So once he's back, it's likely going to boost Teravainen's production as well. But either way, I would rather have Pacioretty over Teravainen because of the shot volume and the goal production, both of which are a little bit more scarce on the waiver wire. So right now, you can go and try to plug the hole with some waiver guys. I would try to target a guy like Pacioretty, who's more likely to have a better season because he's coming over to a new team and then trying to, just rekindle his goal-scoring touch, as opposed to a guy like Teravainen, who's trying to come off of injury and try to get it done on the power play. It's really apples to oranges, but as a personal preference, I would rather have Pacioretty, and I do have him on my IR stashed right now. So if you don't have him, if somebody in your league does have him, maybe float a lowball trade offer, or maybe try to just pick him up off the waiver wire. There's a couple of other guys on IR right now that you could target. A guy like Nick Ehlers, who's had a setback with a sports hernia surgery, but he's another guy that could do pretty much a lot of what Teravainen usually does, dual position winger with some power play coverage and some assists. And then actually Nick Ehlers started to get his goal scoring going last year as well. So I would definitely look at some of these IR guys as opposed to Teravainen. I wouldn't want to keep Teravainen on my IR for that much longer. I wouldn't necessarily see him bouncing back into the top 100 by the end of the season. Now, in the preseason, I was very high on Thatcher Demko. I wanted him on my team really badly, and I wasn't able to get him. So at this point in the season, I'm relieved. But if you got him, you're panicking and wondering what to do. And a lot of you have left comments for me asking what to do, and my advice hasn't really changed. You got to hold tight. So last year, Demko had a horrible month of November, going 4-7 with a 323 goals against and an 896 save percentage, which is exactly when I dropped him from my team. And then immediately after that, the Canucks fired Travis Green. They brought in Boost Boudreau. They went on a tear, backstopped by an incredible month of December for Demko, where he went 7-1 with a 172 goals against and a 946 save percentage. And then he kept that going for most of the rest of the season. So the question is, can this happen this year? Are the Canucks likely to fire Boudreau? All I can say is don't make the mistake I did and give up on the guy after a bad month or two. I understand how bad your goaltending is right now, but maybe try to take the time to shore up your other goalies and try to start Demko when he has an advantageous chance at winning. And when is that exactly? Well, if you look at the bottom right, you can see the splits by division. Now, Demko's actually been pretty decent against the Pacific Division. He's 2-1 with a 908 and a 303 goals against, which is comparatively better than all these other divisions that he's played against. So maybe try to not start him against Eastern Conference teams because he's been pretty abysmal at that. And maybe, don't start him against Central teams for right now. It's also worth mentioning that last year at home, Demko had a 251 goals against and a 922 save percentage. And on the road, he was a 295 goals against and a 907. So maybe right now, if you have him, don't drop him, but only start him when he's at home or when he's playing a Pacific Division rival, because those are the two opportunities that are going to give him the best chance at winning. Now, he is starting to pick up his game almost right on cue. Demko played a really good game against LA the other night, stopping 37 of 38 with a 971 save percentage and got the W. So maybe he can use this as a springboard, but if you drafted him, you probably drafted him too high to drop him for nothing. And nobody's going to offer anything in a trade right now that you're going to want to take for a goalie that you drafted that high as your G1. You're likely not going to replace him as a G1 with a trade. So the only option that you have right now is to hold on. If you really don't believe in him this year, wait for him to have a good week or two and then try to flip him. Don't try to flip him right now when he's ranked 630 and his numbers look like this, because nobody's going to want to bite on that. So try to play the media game, and if he starts to get some media attention and if you still don't believe in him, then maybe try to flip him. But I wouldn't do that either. I would just hold on to him and wait for him to turn this around. Now, another guy that you are probably disappointed in is Vladimir Tarasenko, ADP 53 in most drafts, usually going in the 4th or 5th round. And if you were listening to me preseason, that would have seemed a little bit too high for Tarasenko given his production. Now, I didn't explicitly mention him in the overdraft candidate video, but he was in that graph that I was showing during that video, and he overperformed his 5-year average by 0.20 points per game. And he did regain his goal scoring touch last season with a 0.45 goal per game average, which was closer to what he was averaging during his prime. But you also probably wanted him for his 3 shot per game average and his 0.29 power play points per game. This year, he's still putting up points. So 13 points in 16 games. He is relatively close to his shot volume at 2.75 shots per game thus far, but his power play production is what's slumping down. So he's down to 0.18 power play points per game with only 3 power play points on the season. So what you see on the bottom right here is Tarasenko's goals above expected. And last year, he was 8.7 above what he was expected to get. And typically in his prime, he was between 8 and 12 above expected. This year, he's right around where he's expected to be. So he's not necessarily getting more opportunities and not finishing on them, because then he would be an even further minus, but he's usually scoring more than he's expected to given the lethal nature of his shot. So he's a guy who can score without getting a ton of chances because of his release. So what do you do if you own Tarasenko? Now, I mentioned in the Week 7 video that almost all the Blues players are starting to turn it around. Jordan Kyrou, Robert Thomas, Buchnevich, Krug, Bennington, who I picked up off waivers, is turning it around. So I would sit tight on Tarasenko and hope the Blues offense starts cranking it up. Just for an example, last year, the Blues had the 3rd most goals for in the league. This year, they're 25th, and basically nothing has changed in terms of personnel. Right now, their expected goals is even worse at 29th in the league, so they aren't getting a ton of chances as of yet, and that may be a little bit troublesome, but as I just mentioned, they have the personnel to turn this around. They're starting to get some better goaltending, and they're on a 6-game winning streak after trouncing the Ducks last night. And if any team can get your offense going, it's the Ducks. So if you need someone to fill in the goal and shot production in the meantime, I've been mentioning Owen Tippett this week as a shot volume leader with some goal and hit production as well. So maybe try streaming a guy like him if that's what you're trying to get in terms of Tarasenko. If you're looking for goals and shots, and he's not giving you those right now because he's only got 4 goals on the year, and the shot volume's okay at 2.75, but it's not exactly what you were hoping for. But other than that, I would definitely try to keep him and wait for this turnaround because St. Louis is coming. And if you haven't been paying attention, just look at the ownership levels of guys like Kyrou and Thomas and Buchnevich even. These guys have been trending in the right direction over the last couple of weeks, and I would expect the same for Tarasenko. Currently, their power play is 12th in the league, so I would expect a little bit more of a bump from the power play unit. They usually use 2 units, so it just kind of depends on who they're targeting with the power play units, but Tarasenko is a guy who doesn't need a ton of chances to score. His shooting percentage is not exactly where it's usually supposed to be, so I would definitely keep him and try to wait this out. Now, another guy that is probably not doing anything for you on your team is Patrick Kane, but he's potentially the best buy low opportunity in the league right now, and I'll show you exactly why. So you likely drafted him in the 3rd or 4th round because nobody wanted him, seeing as how he was on a terrible Chicago team with nobody to work with, and as of now it appears as though fading him was the right move. However, you're missing one massive piece to the puzzle. He will absolutely get traded before the deadline. There's no way a rebuilding team in Chicago who tore it down to the studs will allow him to stay on their roster and walk to free agency for nothing. And you're going to want to find whoever has him in your league right now and try to lowball them, because the closer we get to the trade deadline, the more Patrick Kane trade chatter there will be, especially in markets like Edmonton and New York and anywhere else that needs an elite right winger for the playoffs. So once that trade chatter starts to build, it's going to be harder to get him. So you want to get him now while it's quiet on the trade front and he's struggling. And he is actually struggling a bit. So if you look at his 5-year average, 1.16 point per game. That's really good for a 5-year average, and a 0.39 goal per game 5-year average, usually good for a 31 goal pace over an 82 game season. And usually he's shooting between 11 and 16%. This year, he's 0.39 points per game below his 5-year average. He's half as high in his goals per game average, and his shooting percentage is unsustainably low at 5.7%. He actually just scored his first goal in his last 10 games last night, so maybe it's already starting to turn around for him. To show you my conviction, I'll now show you a trade that I just made for Patrick Kane, and I can't believe this one actually went through either. I gave up Matt Murray to the Lake Mohawk Moose, who was absolutely desperate for goaltending wins, and I got an underperforming Patrick Kane. But this is the type of trade that could help you win your league during the playoffs. I've seen it before, and someone will be facing you in the playoffs or in the finals and ask themselves, Jesus, how does this guy have all these good players and Patrick Kane? This is how. You buy him low right now when nobody wants him. Be that guy. Don't be the guy that gave up on one of the best players of our generation at a time when he was playing some of his worst hockey of his career. And if you look at the difference in point per game, it's pretty stark. I mean, this is a 5-year average. He was above this last year. He was closer to 1.3 points per game last year than this. So for him to be this low, it's obviously a result of his lack of teammates around him that can potentially bury. I do think he misses Alex DeBrincat in that regard. But he's not going to stay on Chicago forever. They're going to eventually trade him, and you're going to want to get him before they do. So this would be the number one buy low opportunity for me, and I just put my money where my mouth was, and I bit the bullet and traded for him. So just showing you how much conviction I have in Patrick Kane this year. And last, but probably most on your mind if you drafted him, is Jonathan Huberdeau. And the question is, why did you draft him? So I highlighted him briefly in my forward overdraft candidates video this preseason, as last year his production was 0.31 points per game above his 5-year average. I mentioned in many videos that I used to love Huberdeau in the 4th round. He always exceeded his draft position there, but I didn't like him being drafted at the back end of the 1st round or early 2nd round, which is where you had to get him this year. So why? Well, number one, there's almost no way he'd repeat last year's 1.43 point per game season. Even if he was in Florida, it's too difficult to follow up a career year with another career year. There's an example. So I've been playing fantasy football for a couple years. I had Jonathan Taylor last year. He had a career year as a running back. And this year he was the number one drafted player in most leagues. And I don't understand why anyone would have drafted him, because you cannot follow up a career year with another career year. And that's what you were hoping to get out of Huberdeau. Secondly, he was coming to a new team and he was traded against his will. So he was traded in the Tkachuk deal, but unlike Tkachuk, he didn't have a say in the matter. Tkachuk kind of forced his way to Florida because he had the no move protection and he still had a year left on his contract. Number three, he's playing with the money bag syndrome. So despite not necessarily wanting to come over, he signed a massive 8-year, $84 million contract in Calgary. And then number four, Daryl Sutter. You're asking a player to repeat a career year on a new team with new line mates, heavy pockets from his new deal, and playing for a coach who notoriously wants his teams playing defense and limiting chances, not a run and gun offensive coach like he was used to in Florida. So with all that said, you drafted him anyways, and now you're screwed. So what do? You cannot trade him right now because he's at a 0.57 point per game average, less than half of what he should be at right now. You gotta wait for him to have a really strong week where he puts up more than a point per game average and maybe gets a little bit of media attention. During that bump in media attention, you want to try to get what you can for him. Try to target a player like one of the buy low targets that we've talked about in this video and in some of the weekly videos, even in the early player trends videos, like Kyle Connor comes to mind as a nice buy low. Nick Eagler's on IR. I mentioned him before. He could be a good buy low. You could go for a guy like Pacioretty, who we mentioned earlier, someone who has the potential to help you put up points during the playoffs if you can get there. But you don't want to trade him right now when his trade value is this low, when he's putting up these levels of point totals and when everybody knows that he's underperforming. He's 299 in Yahoo category leagues right now, and you drafted him in the top 12. So you're not getting what you need, and I get it. It's tough, it's frustrating, but you got to try to boost his value before you trade him or get him off of your roster however you can. I don't think this is going to be a bounce back kind of year for him, though I do think he starts to regress closer to his 5-year average, which means that from now until he gets to that point, he will probably be putting up more than a point per game average. So you kind of have to wait for that to happen. And then once he starts to get kind of close to that 1 point per game number, then you probably want to trade him. It's always difficult with a guy who comes over to a new team, has to make new chemistry with new line mates and find his way through a new city and all this stuff. And that's one of the reasons why I wasn't exactly too high on Huberdeau or Tkachuk going into this season. But if you've drafted him, you've made that mistake, and now you got to live with it for a little bit until he starts to come around and produce a little bit. Wait for his value to go up and then try to trade him when he's a little bit higher up than he is now. Now, we do have an honorable mention, someone that you were likely also targeting as your G1 who is struggling just a bit right now, especially compared to last season, and that's Jacob Markstrom. And there's a theme here. So what I hope you're seeing and taking away from my analysis is that it's almost impossible to follow up a career year with another career year in any sport. And it works in almost all leagues, in all formats in fantasy sports. You cannot expect a guy to do what they did last year necessarily. But with that said, there was nothing in his file that made me seem like he was going to, be dangerous to own this year. And I was high on Markstrom in the preseason because of his strength of his team defense and his overall play last year. But right now, in 14 games, he's 7-4-2, which isn't bad, but a 3.11 goals against and an 887 save percentage. His goals saved above expected is at 0.9 right now, so right around where he should be performing at. So what's going on? Well, Calgary is 4th in the league at expected goals against, but 14th in actual goals against. They're 5th in the league in terms of goals against above expected. They aren't giving up a lot of high danger chances against, and none of this adds up to a cohesive reason why Markstrom is struggling. Markstrom isn't giving up a lot of low danger goals, and the Flames aren't giving up a lot of high danger chances. It's the medium danger chances that have been a problem for Markstrom. He's minus 3.63 goals saved below expected in terms of medium danger chances. It's worth mentioning what happened in the offseason with Calgary. So Brad Treliving was given a lot of credit for what he was able to accomplish given the trade demands of Tkachuk and Gaudreau leaving in free agency, and he did bring in a lot of pieces, but what that indicates is that a lot of turnover has taken place and the team hasn't found their chemistry yet. So the Flames sit at 8-7-2, 2 points behind Edmonton with a game at hand, but this seems to be a case of not finding their chemistry yet. I'd look for Calgary to be more of a second half team, and that will mean a great second half performance out of Markstrom and potential bubble team bonus on top of that. So if you listen to my goalie targets video, the bubble team bonus is basically if a goalie is needed down the stretch for the team to get into the playoffs, they're going to ride him game in, game out, and you're going to have him starting on your team during your fantasy playoffs. So that could actually help you down the stretch. The only way that they make the playoffs this year, in my opinion, is if Markstrom gets back to his form. So they'll have to play him down the stretch to get into the playoffs. And it's American Thanksgiving, and they're a bubble team right now. And teams that are in a playoff spot at American Thanksgiving have a 77.5% chance of making the playoffs. So I would consider this a buy low opportunity on Markstrom. And if you have him, you got to stick with them because they've had a lot of turnover, but the defensive pieces are in place and they've actually been limiting chances just as we talked about. But that's going to do it for this video. If you have any other players that you want some guidance on, leave them in the comments section below. I know a lot of people are worried about Hedman. He's just impossible to replace, and I don't see him underperforming like this all year. But any others, leave them in the comments below, and I'll try to get back to as many of them as I can. If you're interested, I'm probably going to be doing a live stream Q&A tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern. So if you have more questions, we can go over them then. But I want to thank you for watching, liking, and subscribing, and I will see you in the next one.